You are alone in the dark between two possibilities, breathing in both of them at once. Before we begin, hold that pulse at the base of your skull, the one that insists only one of you is alive. Tonight we will test that certainty until it frays like nerve-end silk. You think of the universe as solid. Objects click into place. Events occur in sequence. States resolve. Your heartbeat, your memories, the weight of your eyelids, all feel unambiguously actual. But in 1935, Erwin Schrödinger sketched a thought experiment that has been stalking reality ever since, a paradox meant to expose the absurdity buried inside quantum mechanics. He sealed an unseen cat, a vial of hydrocyanic acid, a Geiger counter, and a single atom of radioactive material inside a steel chamber. If the atom decays within an hour, the counter triggers, the vial shatters, the cat dies. If the atom does not decay, the cat lives. Quantum theory insists the atom exists in a superposition of decayed, not decayed, until observation. Therefore, until someone opens the box, the cat is alive and dead simultaneously. That grotesque bothness isn't metaphor. It is experimentally confirmed in laboratories that isolate photons, electrons, even entire molecules. The 2019 experiment by Yale physicists placed a tiny mechanical resonator, billions of atoms, into a superposed vibration state. Reality, under sufficient isolation, refuses to choose. It insists on maybes. You, however, demand choice. Your nervous system evolved to survive tigers and betrayals, not quantum riddles. Ambiguity breeds cortisol, so your mind patches the paradox with story. The cat is either alive or dead. We just don't know which yet. But the mathematics says otherwise. The wave function describing the system contains both outcomes entangled. You imagine the paradox ends when you open the lid. Observation collapses the wave function. Certainty returns. Except that in 1961, Eugene Wigner added a second observer, his friend, inside the lab. Wigner stands outside. Friend opens the box. From friend's viewpoint, the cat snaps to a definite state. But for Wigner, who hasn't peaked, friend plus cat remain in a combined superposition. Two incompatible realities coexist. Your reassurance crumbles. Observation is not purely physical, it is relational. Reality branches, tailored to each perspective. Some interpretations, like many worlds, accept the nightmare literally. Both outcomes persist in non-communicating branches, and consciousness merely rides one. In 2019, Proietti et al. Performed a photonic Wigner's friend experiment, confirming quantum predictions even when observers disagree on facts. Objective reality fractures under measurement. So where is the box, really? Around the cat? Around the lab? Around your skull? You experience a single timeline, but your neurons fire on quantum substrates, built from indeterminate particles guided by decoherence. You are a warm, leaky superposition forced into classical consistency by constant interactions, sight, heat, cosmic rays. Strip those away, impossible in practice, trivial in thought, and your brain becomes a blur of incompatible selves. The you, reading this sentence, and the you, already bored of it, coexist, unresolved, until decoherence pins one down. Consider everyday indecision, whether to reply to that message, whether to quit the job, whether to swallow the pill. You hover in simultaneous yes and no until an observation, an action, collapses the state. But up to that instant, potential yous overlap, claws hooked into each future. Choice feels linear only because consciousness edits the footage and burns the offcuts. Schrödinger wanted to show quantum weirdness couldn't scale to macroscopic life. Instead, life folded around the weirdness. Cats, humans, planets, everything emerges from wave functions. Classical certainty is an after-image, a convenience. Even the collapse may be illusion. In objective collapse theories, the wave function spontaneously localizes. In relational quantum mechanics, facts exist only relative to an observer. In cubism, the wave function is merely your personal betting odds on experience. Each framework rearranges the abyss, but never fills it. Open another box, your skull. Neurons fire, glial cells modulate, neurotransmitters drift across synapses, but the identity that claims ownership, I, is not inside any cell. Split brain surgeries reveal two centers of awareness can inhabit one body, each unaware of the other's private half-world. Where is the observer who collapses you? Perhaps there isn't one, only endless entanglements of sub-observers, each declaring local facts, stitching them into a narrative too persuasive to doubt. Look again at Schrödinger's chamber. Replace the cat with a mirror. Replace the radioactive atom with a random fluctuation in your own brain chemistry. Replace the vial of poison with the quiet inevitability of forgetting. The lid is closed. No external observer will ever open it. Inside, infinite versions of you branch and branch, living and dying in flickers shorter than a neuronal spike. Out here, the storyline feels singular because decoherence hides the carnage. Out here, you call that shelter reality. But the steel is thin. Every dream that contradicts waking life, every déjà vu that rewinds time, every quantum experiment that denies objectivity, taps against the walls. You pretend not to hear, yet you wonder. If the act of reading these, and when it does, when observer and observed dissolve into the same unresolved equation, will you discover you were the cat after all? Or the poison? Or the empty space where certainty used to be? You are standing at a switch. You must decide whether to divert a runaway trolley onto a track where one person will die instead of 5. You hesitate, calculate, act, or don't. Philosophers say this is a moral test, but it is something worse. A trap with no outside. The trolley problem, first formulated by Philippa Foot in 1967 and later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thomson, was never meant to provide a solution. It was a mirror held up to your justifications, a way to ask, do you value lives equally? Are you a utilitarian or a deontologist? But beneath that academic language hides something more disturbing. Moral reasoning is recursive, self-destructive, and rooted in illusions of agency. You think the problem is abstract, but every policy, every system, every act of war or medical triage is a trolley problem, extended across time and distance. And like the original scenario, the rules are rigged. You are always too late. The trolley is already moving. The choice was made years ago, by others, and now you're only pretending your hand on the switch matters. In modified versions of the problem, the illusions crack. What if you must push a man off a bridge to stop the trolley? What if the one person is your child and the 5 are strangers? What if each outcome births new dilemmas, spawning infinite forks in a moral fractal that folds back on itself? Studies by Joshua Green and others using fMRI imaging show your brain lights up in different regions depending on the version of the trolley problem. Emotional reasoning activates in one form, logical reasoning in another, but there is no unified moral compass, only competing systems fighting to seize the narrative. You are not choosing between right and wrong. You are choosing which algorithm of justification you want to believe in, and the moment you choose, you forget you had options. The loop resets. The problem reappears in a new mask. Who gets the ventilator? Who deserves asylum? Which lie is acceptable to maintain peace? The trolley always returns. It doesn't matter what you decide. because the framing is the trap. It reduces morality to binaries, humans to tokens, ethics to equations. And once you accept the terms, once you believe the question must be answered, you've already lost. You cannot reason your way out of this loop, because reasoning is how you were brought in. The very impulse to solve the paradox keeps it alive. The tracks extend forever. Every solution births another dilemma. Every answer is a seed for the next question. And even worse, the trolley isn't theoretical. Real lives are run over every day by systemic inertia, policies, and inaction, disguised as neutrality. You're not at the switch. You are the switch. You are part of a machine that grinds decisions into statistics. But the machine has no conductor, no brakes. It moves by inertia and language, by justification and delay. You can jump in front of it. You can refuse to choose. But even refusal is a choice, a new track, and you will always be measured by its outcomes, even if you never agreed to the rules. What began as a thought experiment is now an ecosystem. Ethics classes, war rooms, corporate decisions, a ritual that trains you to weigh lives like currency. A simulation that flattens compassion into numbers. The trolley was never the point. You were. The entire scenario was built to expose your limits, to trap you in recursive guilt, to show that every decision fractures reality into incompatible futures, and no version of you survives all of them intact. So now, you're back at the switch, except this time you're tied to the track, and the trolley is inside your skull. Who decides what you're worth, and how many versions of you have already been run over while you waited to feel certain? You wake up and stretch your limbs, trusting that the body you inhabit is the same as yesterday's. You look in the mirror and see continuity. A face aged by time, perhaps, but still you. The same story, the same presence, the same name echoing back from every surface that recognizes you. But that certainty is a trick of language. This is the paradox of the ship of Theseus. The Greek historian Plutarch posed it over 2,000 years ago. If a ship is preserved by replacing its rotting planks, one by one, until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? Your body answers yes every morning. But your cells are in revolt. Your skin replaces itself roughly every month. Your red blood cells last 4 months. Your bones, once thought permanent, are in a cycle of regeneration lasting a decade. Neurons, immune cells, even your gut lining. Each part of you is a temporary placeholder in a permanent role. And yet, the name remains. I. In 2014, researchers published studies on memory plasticity showing that the act of remembering a memory rewrites it. You do not retrieve your past. You recreate it each time. What you call a self is built on the repetition of a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a structural one. A convenience of continuity in a body of sand. The self you identify with is a looping narrative composed of snapshots, semantic scripts, and contextual reconstructions. There is no original you underneath it, only the illusion of cohesion reinforced by pattern. But the paradox deepens. Suppose each plank removed from Theseus's ship is stored and later reassembled into a ship. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The one that continued in time, or the one that preserved the parts? Now ask, if your childhood thoughts, feelings, and memories could be reconstructed precisely, downloaded, replayed, embodied, would that be you, or a simulation? Is your continuity biological, psychological, narrative, or none of these? Split-brain studies in neuroscience showed that severing the corpus callosum, the bridge between brain hemispheres, can result in 2 centers of consciousness inhabiting the same skull. Each hemisphere has its own preferences, perceptions, and behaviors. Which one is you? If you split and persist, which side owns the name? You want to believe the self is a stable object, that your consciousness rides a clean arc through time, holding identity like a thread. But identity is not a thread. It is a ship built from rot, and the more you examine it, the more you realize the ship was never whole. You are a story retold by unreliable narrators using borrowed metaphors to explain a flickering process held together by inertia. You say, "I remember who I was." But who was the I doing the remembering? And who is the I being remembered? Are they the same because they share a name? Because they share a body? Because they share a point of view in a moment that's already gone? And if your name was changed, your memories erased, your preferences altered, what would remain? If the planks were swapped out not all at once but slowly, through time and trauma and sleep and repetition, how would you know when the real you was gone? You wouldn't, because the real you never arrived, only fragments rearranged, only wood painted over, only echoes mistaking themselves for a voice. So if nothing remains of the ship that carried you here, what exactly do you think survived the journey? Speak your world into existence. You name things, define them, categorize, arrange, reduce. You think this is understanding. You think naming is knowing. But you have confused the map for the territory. This is not a metaphor. It is a trap. The phrase was coined by Alfred Korzybski in 1931. The map is not the territory. A map is a representation, a simplification. It must omit details to be useful. The moment it includes everything, it is no longer a map. It is the world, and therefore useless. But your brain makes this same mistake with language. You believe the words are the reality. They aren't. You say tree and forget the infinite complexity inside that sound. You say justice, consciousness, freedom, love, and mistake the symbol for the thing itself. But these are containers, placeholders, loose approximations trying to wrap chaos in order. Every time you describe reality, you filter it, simplify it, kill it. You flatten the jagged truth into syllables and forget what was lost. When Korzybski warned of this, he wasn't speaking philosophically. He meant it neurologically. The brain constructs semantic layers on top of raw experience. Words become interfaces, but they also become barriers. In 1956, George A. Miller published his famous paper, The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2, suggesting that your working memory can hold only about 7 chunks of information at once. Language is how you reduce the infinite to the manageable, but in doing so, you slice reality into lies you can memorize. This is the root of all ideology. Language locks thought into templates. Once a word is formed, it shapes how you think about what it refers to. Research in linguistic relativity, what used to be called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, shows that different languages alter cognition itself. Some languages lack tenses, others don't distinguish between left and right, but between cardinal directions. Some have no words for numbers beyond 5. They don't see the world the way you do, because language is not a passive tool. It is a weapon. It directs attention. It sculpts cognition. It defines the boundary of the thinkable. You say person and mean it uniformly, but every culture defines personhood differently. In some, trees have spirits. In others, a fetus becomes a person only after birth. In law, a corporation is a person. But what then is a mind, a soul, an individual? Your words circle meanings that never land. Even yourself is a linguistic illusion. The pronoun I gives shape to a fluid process, but there is no fixed I beneath the utterance, just the echo of a voice inventing itself. Ludwig Wittgenstein tried to trap meaning inside logical form. Then He renounced the effort. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But silence never saved anyone. So we keep speaking, keep naming, keep drawing maps on blank skin and pretending they were always there. Language turns reality into narrative, and narrative becomes memory, and memory becomes identity. But none of these are stable. Change the words, and you change the self. This is why propaganda works, why cults rename their members, why trauma is often stored in wordless states, because language fails to contain it. And yet you keep trying. You keep reaching for clarity with tools that can only blur. You say, I just want to explain how I feel. But what if your feeling has no name? What if some truths live outside grammar? What if the most honest thoughts are unthinkable in your language? The map is not the territory, the word is not the world, and the self is not the sentence that carries it. So tell me, if every word you've ever spoken is only a shadow of a thing, who taught you to mistake the shadow for the light? You believe you understand yourself. You believe the thoughts inside your head have origin, direction, and purpose. That your decisions are driven by reasons. That your preferences, your tastes, your values are internal truths, something you own, but you are wrong. This is the illusion of introspection, the belief that you have direct access to the causes of your thoughts and actions. It is seductive. It feels like self-knowledge, but it is only a narrative engine spinning after the fact. In 1977, psychologists Richard Nisbett and Timothy DeCamp Wilson conducted a series of experiments showing that people often invent reasons for their behavior, reasons that are demonstrably false. In one study, subjects were asked to choose among identical items, like pairs of stockings. When asked why they picked a certain one, participants gave detailed explanations. The color looked richer, the texture was better, but the items were identical. The real reason? Position bias. The last item was more likely to be chosen, but no one reported that. Their brains had filled in a plausible story after the choice had already been made. This isn't rare, it is universal. You make a choice. Then you justify it. The justification feels like cause, but it's just narrative glue, a memory patch, a lie told so convincingly you forget it's fiction. You think you choose what you like, but preferences are unstable. In a 2006 study, people were shown pairs of photographs, asked to choose which person they found more attractive, and then, unbeknownst to them, handed the photo they did not choose. Many failed to notice the swap, yet still offered explanations for why they had chosen it. Your mind does not seek truth, it seeks coherence. Even your emotions deceive you. You say, I'm angry because he insulted me. But anger begins before language, before interpretation. Your body floods with chemicals and tension. Only after the fact does your mind construct why you are angry. The order is reversed. This is confabulation. The brain invents reasons to explain unconscious processes. Split brain studies again reveal the horror of this mechanism. In Michael Gazzaniga's famous experiments, patients with severed hemispheres were shown different images in each visual field and given conflicting instructions. The left brain, the interpreter, would fabricate elaborate, false reasons to explain the right hemisphere's behavior, never realizing the deception. A hand reaches for something, and the mouth explains why, even though they were never connected. You live in that illusion. The storyteller part of your brain is always explaining things it doesn't understand, and the rest of you believes it. This is why you cling to certainty, why you say things like, I've always been this way, as if your current self is a lighthouse, not a flickering light from a ship that's already gone, as if your desires have continuity. But neuroscience shows otherwise. Your preferences can be manipulated by framing, timing, and context. Your memories can be rewritten with a single suggestion. Your values shift depending on stress, hunger, social context, and time of day. There is no stable you beneath the noise. Only aftershocks of action, wrapped in the language of ownership. You do not know why you said that thing. You do not know why you pulled away from that person. You do not know why that image made you feel empty. But your brain won't let you admit that, so it fabricates meaning. Because meaning feels safer than chaos, even when it's false, even when it builds your identity out of errors. You look back and see a pattern, but the pattern is retroactive. You see intention where there was only chance, purpose where there was only reflex. You think, I am who I am because I chose to be. But what if that's never been true? What if choice is a postscript, not a cause? What if everything you've ever explained about yourself was just a story you were forced to invent to survive the void? And if so, who exactly is listening to that story now? Imagine this. You're in a crowded room. Someone collapses to the floor, unmoving. You hesitate. You look around. No one acts. So neither do you. You believe you would help. You believe you would be the exception. But the bystander effect, revealed in the brutal psychology of real-world horror, says otherwise. In 1964, Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment in Queens, New York. The New York Times reported that 38 people watched from their windows and did nothing. The number was debated later, but the phenomenon became infamous. Psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane studied this paralysis. What they found is devastating. The more people are present, the less likely anyone is to act. Responsibility becomes a gas diffused into everyone's lungs. The weight of action slips from your hands because someone else might carry it. And in that thin moment, between awareness and collapse, you wait. It isn't because you are evil, it is because you are social. You read the room for cues. If no one else panics, you assume it's fine. If others hesitate, your brain tells you it's safe to delay. This is pluralistic ignorance, the shared delusion that everything is okay because everyone acts as if it is, even when no one believes it. You trust others' inaction more than your own alarm. Now turn inward. What if you are the one collapsing and the crowd is inside your own skull? You feel the warning signs, the anxiety spike, the depressive weight, the dissociative slip. A part of you cries out, something is wrong, but the rest of you looks around. The social self, the practical self, the inner critic, the future planner. None of them move, so neither do you. This is the internal bystander effect, the paralysis of the self in the face of its own distress. You fragment into roles, each assuming another part will handle it, but no part acts. And slowly, you fall. Studies show that people are often more compassionate to strangers than themselves. The circuits for empathy activate differently when the suffering belongs to the body they inhabit. Self-compassion requires a structural override, one most brains never learn. You are trained to judge your own pain, to suppress, to compare, to narrate your emotions through utility. So even when your system is collapsing, you tell yourself, someone else has it worse, I'll deal with it later, this isn't real. And just like the crowd outside Kitty Genovese's window, your mind stands still. It watches you suffer, silently. You believe you are a unified whole, but the mind is modular, a committee of partial observers, and none of them want to take responsibility. Each module waits for consensus, but consensus never comes, and no one saves you. Ask yourself, how many times have you seen yourself drown in silence and done nothing? How many times have you denied your own pain because the rest of you looked away? The bystander effect is not just a social flaw. It is the architecture of your psychology. It is the loophole that lets suffering persist without blame, because no one acted, because everyone was waiting, because everyone thought someone else would stop the bleeding. But there is no one else. You are the crowd. You are the witness. You are the victim. And still, you do nothing. So, when your next moment of collapse arrives, and you scream for help inside your own mind, will any part of you step forward? Or will they all quietly agree that it's probably not their place? You look into a mirror and see something you recognize. A shape, a face, a name. You make a small movement, blink, tilt your head, and the image moves with you. That's me, you think. That's who I am. But you are not the reflection. You are the one who believes in it. In 1970, psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. devised the mirror test to measure self-recognition in animals. A red dot is secretly placed on an animal's forehead. If the animal, upon seeing its reflection, touches the mark on its own body, it is taken as evidence of self-awareness. Chimpanzees passed the test. So did elephants, dolphins, magpies, and certain ants. Human infants typically begin to pass it around 18 months. This was hailed as a marker of consciousness, the ability to recognize the self as separate from the world. But what does it mean? Really? You recognize a configuration of visual information. You identify patterns in a feedback loop, eyes that align with yours, lips that move when you move. But recognition is not comprehension. You do not know the thing in the mirror. You only accept its familiarity. Now consider this. In cases of Capgras delusion, individuals recognize the face of a loved one, but are convinced the person is an imposter. Their facial recognition circuits are intact, but the emotional resonance is gone. The brain sees the shape, but not the feeling. Isn't that what you experience when you stare too long into a mirror? The uncanny sense that the thing looking back is almost you, but hollow. You try to correct this discomfort by projecting identity. You smile to prove you are real. You adjust your posture, your hair, your mask. But underneath, the reflection says nothing about your inner life. The mirror doesn't see you. It reflects a corpse animated by memory and hope. In 2018, neuroscientists discovered that the medial prefrontal cortex, associated with self-related processing, activates strongly when you look at your own face. But this is not confirmation of identity. It is a recursive loop of attention, a system spotlighting a model that your brain believes in only because it must. You do not see yourself. You see your expectation of yourself. And that expectation is wrong. You are not symmetrical. You are not fixed. You are not the same person from 1 hour to the next. The image you trust is a lagging indicator, a fossil of a moment that no longer exists. In 1903, psychologist Charles Cooley coined the term looking-glass self to describe how your identity forms based on how you think others see you. Your self-image is not internal, it is relational. You are constructed through the imagined gaze of others, layered reflections of reflections, and when no one is looking, you disappear. That's why mirrors feel so unsettling in empty rooms, not because you fear what's there, but because you sense what's missing. You sense the lie, that the thing looking back has no mind, that it waits for your signal, then plays its part. But only when you're watching. Somewhere in you, a small child still checks the bathroom mirror at night, not to admire, but to confirm, to prove that you still exist, that the reflection still matches, that the thread has not been broken. But what if it already has? What if every time you blink, the thing in the mirror doesn't? What if it's simply memorizing your face, waiting to return it at the next appointed hour while you rot quietly beneath the skin of your own illusion? And what happens the day it finally gets your timing wrong? The day the face looking back doesn't match the story you told yourself? What will you believe in then? The face? Or the silence beneath it? You remember your first heartbreak, the color of the room, the sound of the voice that broke you, the pause between words. You remember how long you cried, what song was playing, what you told yourself after. But none of it happened that way. The colors weren't those colors. The song wasn't that song. The words weren't spoken the way you recall. The memory is a replica, crafted not from truth but from fragments, stitched together by your mind in the dark. This is not a glitch. It is the system, working exactly as designed. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, a live performance. Each time you recall an event, your brain retrieves a fragile outline, fills in gaps, recolors emotion, reshapes meaning, and stores the new version as if it were the original. You are not remembering the past. You are remembering the last time you remembered it. In 1995, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated how disturbingly easy it is to implant false memories. In one experiment, subjects were shown doctored childhood photos, one depicting them in a hot air balloon ride that never happened. After repeated interviews, 50% of participants remembered the event in vivid detail. Some even added elaborate context, what they wore, how they felt. This phenomenon is called the misinformation effect. Post-event information contaminates your memory, altering what you believe to be true. It's not subtle, it's seismic. Courtroom testimonies have crumbled under it. Entire lives have been redirected by it. And yet, you still trust your mind. Your earliest memories, are they real? Or were they shaped by stories your parents told you, photographs you saw, dreams you had as a child? Can you really distinguish between memory and imagination? Your brain can't. The hippocampus, which helps consolidate memory, doesn't store truth. It stores patterns. The amygdala tints those patterns with emotional intensity. The more traumatic or emotional an event, the more distorted it becomes. You remember how it felt more than what occurred. And over time, the pattern becomes more symbol than snapshot. You remember how things were, but it's no longer anchored to anything outside of you. So what about your identity? If you are built from memory, if your sense of self is stitched together from remembered choices, remembered pain, remembered growth, what happens when those memories aren't real? What is left of you when the scaffolding collapses? In patients with confabulation syndrome, typically caused by brain injury or Korsakoff syndrome, the mind fabricates entire pasts that feel utterly real. These patients defend their false histories with conviction. Their identities are built on fictions. But so is yours, only your fictions are more socially acceptable. Because everyone is confabulating. Every timeline you've constructed is contaminated by mood, hindsight, language, and bias. Every image you recall has been recolored by fear, guilt, or longing. Even your happiest moments are partially false. You are a character in a story told by a liar who doesn't know they're lying. Even now, you think back to yesterday, what you said, how you felt, who you were. But how do you know that memory isn't already warped by stress, by hope, by the quiet desperation to feel like life makes sense? How much of your past is just a correction you made to avoid confronting the truth? And if you can't trust your own memory, if even your trauma might be misremembered, reimagined, or invented entirely, then who, exactly, do you think you are remembering? You think you just made a choice. You read the question, you considered it, you responded. You felt something like freedom, a flicker of agency. But that sensation, that feeling of choice is not proof that you chose. It's just a trick of timing, a post hoc signal, a ghost. You were always going to say yes. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that would shatter the illusion of volition. Subjects were asked to move their fingers while watching a clock. They were to note the precise moment they decided to act. What Libet found was chilling. The brain initiated the action, a readiness potential, more than 300 milliseconds before the subject became consciously aware of deciding. Your brain moved before you did. Later replications and refinements, like the studies by Soon et al., 2008, pushed this even further. Patterns in the brain could predict a decision up to 7 seconds before the subject reported making it. Your consciousness is not the origin of action, it is the narrator of it. A witness trying to explain the movement after the fact, and yet you still believe in free will, not because there's evidence but because the alternative is unbearable. The philosopher Daniel Wegner coined the term the illusion of conscious will. He showed that we infer authorship over actions the same way we infer causes in the external world. If intention precedes movement, if it feels like we chose it, then we conclude I did this. But correlation is not causation. The sensation of will is a side effect, a user interface. Your consciousness is a lagging indicator of decisions already made in the dark machinery of the brain. The self is not the captain, it is the spokesperson, and the speeches are written by someone else. So what about responsibility? What about guilt, morality? If there is no choice, is there justice? You feel the cognitive recoil, but I choose not to harm people. I choose who I love. I chose this life. And yet each of those choices was influenced, shaped by factors outside your control: genetics, upbringing, context, trauma, momentary chemistry, what you ate for lunch, whether it rained when you were 6. You do not choose what you desire. You do not choose what disgusts you. You do not choose your deepest impulses, nor the timing of your regrets. You are the sum of a storm, pretending to steer. Even your resistance to this idea was inevitable. Your outrage, your denial, your dismissal, all predicted by the variables you didn't choose. Sam Harris calls free will an illusion so complete that to say it is an illusion is to be misunderstood. He's right, because even understanding this doesn't liberate you. It just reveals the cell you're in. You are the puppet that believes it is the puppeteer. The dance is already choreographed, and your thoughts are just the music catching up. Now look backward. Trace your choices. When did you first learn to value reason? When did you first feel fear? When did your identity first harden? When did the idea of you begin? Did you ever actually choose who you became, or were you assembled by events? And if all this is true, if everything you've done was a result of causes stretching back before your birth, then what part of you do you think is free? What do you imagine exists outside the chain? And if you are bound by causes you do not control, what exactly is it that you're responsible for? You're reading this now, and something in you feels like it is doing the reading. A center, a witness, a thing behind your eyes that looks out onto the world. You can feel it, an eye that experiences, decides, observes, the fixed point from which all things are seen. But look closer. Try to find the observer, not metaphorically, literally. In every moment of inner silence, ask, where am I looking from? You might feel something behind the eyes, but this is just proprioception, a body map. You may feel your thoughts centered in the skull, but this is just where your auditory cortex processes your internal monologue. The observer doesn't exist. There is no homunculus sitting inside your brain, watching a screen. The idea of a central self that experiences everything is an ancient fiction, a byproduct of attention, not its source. Your brain creates a user interface, a clean, seamless illusion of presence. But neurologically, consciousness has no central location. Split brain studies show that the two hemispheres of your brain can operate independently, each with its own perceptions, goals, and memories. What you call you is a negotiation between modules, not a single viewer, but a parliament. And yet, the illusion persists. In 2000, cognitive scientist Thomas Metzinger argued that the self is not a thing, but a model, a constantly updated simulation of the organism, constructed for survival. Your brain creates a self-model that includes location, intention, emotion, and identity. This model is what you are aware of. But the model is not you, it is for you. And worse, it convinces itself that it is real. You are being tricked by your own architecture. This is why deep meditation or psychedelic experience can feel so disturbing. The self dissolves, and you are left with experience without ownership, awareness without the witness. Not because something supernatural is happening, but because the illusion breaks, the mask falls. The I is revealed as a process, not a person. And yet, every time you return to normal thought, the illusion rebuilds itself. You feel like you are the thinker of your thoughts, but studies show that your brain often prepares a thought or action before you become aware of it. The narrator shows up late, reads the script, and takes credit for writing it. So, if there is no observer, then what are you? A simulation of coherence, a process that thinks it is a presence, a bundle of perceptions tied together by language, memory, and spatial mapping. No core, no center, no pilot, just patterns reacting to patterns. In Buddhist philosophy, this is the concept of anatta, non-self, the recognition that the self is a composite, constantly changing, not empty but not owned. Modern neuroscience agrees. There is no brain region that holds the self. The default mode network helps generate the autobiographical narrative, but damage it and the self rearranges. Lose your memory and the I is redefined. Damage your frontal lobe and your values shift. Who you are changes with the machine. So if there is no one home, who is afraid? Who is asking this question? Who is hoping to find an answer? If you are just a construction, if there is no stable witness, no internal master, then what remains when the process ends? What disappears when the simulation powers down? And who exactly is pretending not to know?